Hello, everyone. My name is Stefan TRÜBY, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this edition of the Stuttgart Talks on Architecture. It's the 11th edition, and it's really great to welcome today our lecturer and guest, Ines Weizman. Ines Weizman is the head of the PhD program at the Royal College of Arts School of Architecture. Many people know her also as the key figure behind the Center for Documentary Architecture and Interdisciplinary Research Collective of architectural historians, filmmakers, and digital technologists. And I could mention now many places where and universities where Ines taught and gave lectures. Amongst these places, I should probably also mention the Bauhaus University in Weimar, where Ines taught for many years. But I should mention also, as a little introduction for today's lecture, some of the publications. Ines Weizman is very well known for publications that I can really recommend. I should mention her book, Architecture and the Paradox of Dissidence from 2014. I should also mention her book, Dust and Data, Traces of the Bauhaus Across 100 Years, published in 2019. And the newest book by Ines Weizman is called Documentary Architecture, Dissidence Through Architecture, published in 2020. And I should also mention that this lecture is actually the keynote lecture of a PhD colloquium that both Ines Weizman and I organized. We are not at all exhausted by today's PhD students' presentations. In contrast, fully energized, and we are also looking forward to many more presentations tomorrow. And so I think we are all very much excited to learn more about threads and hinges, the global flow of architectural elements. Ines, the stage is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you for all who have organized this lecture, but also the colloquium. It's a great pleasure to speak within that framework and, in fact, actually to have warmed up a little bit before coming here. And yet giving a lecture seems always new and exciting. Let me actually start with a disclaimer. For the poster of the lecture, I used the image of a cablegram concerning a cacao shipping to Palestine from Cable and Wireless Limited of 1942. It does look very much like an archival find, like the kind of trophy a historian loves finding. And it does fit the lecture. Because I will use this image several times throughout this lecture, together with other archival documents, I would like to concede that it is not taken from any such collection I have visited or consulted. Librarians, archivists, collectors helped me and my team at the Center for Documentary Architecture in our research. This is not thanks to their work. I have won an auction for this image on eBay just a few weeks ago. There were several bidders, and the winning bid, mine, was £3.75. I don't have had any indication as to its provenance. When I was bidding for it, it was advertised without much information. Still, I could not resist to spend a little fortune on it. By the end of the presentation, actually, it would be nice if you tell me if it was a good buy. Looking at my latest acquisition more closely in the next hour, I will attempt to reconstruct some of the context of the cablegram that found itself among all sorts of other eBay offerings. Firstly, you should note that the map, the red text, is not what was being broadcast. These are only the framing. The map is static and the text is dynamic. I shall explain here also why I bought it, perhaps also to my husband, who during the lockdown was quite stunned, if not a bit irritated, to open the door to ever more such deliveries of, for him, suspicious and for me, precious items. I hope that some of the esteemed researchers and scholars and listeners here tonight feel sympathetic with me, as we all have missed libraries and archives and were bound to online resources. The background, you don't see it today, of several books stacked up gives you only a small glimpse of what's going on here. The very fact that the cablegram, a document that documents a cacao beans delivery from Africa, probably from Kenya, to Tel Aviv in 1942, survived until today, and that I now own, might have many reasons. It seems that it was not meant to survive too long. The fact that the punch holes are not perforated or in line with the small lettering on the left side of the receipt hints to a well-organized office secretary keen to file and store these items. Differing actually from the British model of retrospectively poking a pile of papers to tie them with what is today still called treasury tags or India tags, the European way of stationery, office stationery, was the paper puncher. The inventor, this is, let's say, the analysis of this punching here, the inventor of this puncher, this was somebody called Friedrich Sönneken. He also had invented the folder itself with its hinge mechanism that would allow paper to be turned and collected. The mechanism was further developed by Louis Leitz in Stuttgart, Feuerbach. Those based in Stuttgart will know. We might want to suggest that the office in which this document was collected was not run by a British system. While more could be said about the paper quality, which I'm sure some of my fellow researchers have already seen in such precarious state, like here in archives, where this kind of pergament paper is dried out, almost too brittle to touch, to turn the pages, you might agree that those papers preserved in the folder system are much easier to handle for the historian. We also, actually, when we were researching in some archives, we sometimes held accidentally a whole bag of a ring folder in our hands as we were trying to pull out the folder from the archive shelf. It is a very embarrassing feeling, as it seems amateurish and completely irresponsible to potentially make an impact on the legibility of historical documents, potentially even history. But I would like to read this document in relation to the global dissemination of modern architecture and design. Intersectionality. What I want to show in this talk is the intersection of stories, threads, and hinges. The lecture starts with the story of a virus, shifts into the history of the Middle East, and how it intersects with the story of modernism. Hinges is when stories cross. Threads are when they evolve. It is also a reference, of course, to Carlo Ginzburg's method of microhistory, threads and traces. History is being registered in the materiality, organic or inorganic, of our environment in architectures, cultural artifacts, modes of living, and ideas. And I've actually used here as an image, if I had not had my eBay acquisition, I had actually as an image with me this Cabinet d'Architecture by Eileen Gray. It's an image that I was once as a student in Weimar given by Hilde Bartz-Malfatti, who sadly passed away on the last day of the last year. And I have to say, in some ways, she remained in my memories. And strangely, there is something about hinges here. And when we look at the rack by Eileen Gray, we even see the reference to threads. I was myself surprised to see that relation. So history is being registered in the materiality. It might be registered in the painting, in the Louvre, as much as in the soot gathered in the cracks of the facades of our homes and the food we eat. And I love this method, but I understand intersectionality as the necessity to travel with connecting vehicles and to find the hinges that connect different historical threads with objects being the hinges. It is in a way a method of thinking that demands a new method of work. It demands looking at hinges at the intersection points between different issues, like the feminist ways of organizing knowledge and asking, where do issues intersect? How do they intersect? How do we promote and value these intersections? Find the hinge. You start with a hinge, with a point of intersection. Where does, for example, climate change and social movement intersect? Where physically a forest, where protest happens when a forest burns down. We are in an epidemic, a health crisis. It intersects with racial struggle because, sorry, because racialized people are, no, it's not, I spoke a lot today. Because racialized people are disproportionately victims of the pandemic, which also reveals the structural racism in our society. In the context of intersectional thinking, you never look at the same single issue alone. From the cross point, you begin to unpack and travel outwards along those assembled nodes of knowledge. As this lecture was meant as a hinge to a shared colloquium of doctoral students between the University of Stuttgart and the RCA, I can see maybe alarmed colleagues who rather promote precise, concise, a time and space-bound thesis, rather than a chaotic travel along a web of threads and hinges. In our group at the RCA, we explore different methods that allow us both to unpack and restack and reorganize our research. I always encourage to think of architecture both as media, materiality, and organizational device that could help us diverge, deflect, perhaps even transgress conventions of research and thought, and reassemble disparate histories and trajectories of research. Recently, I produced a short piece on the history of the elevator pitch, which reflected on the elevator ride itself, the experience of vertically cutting through the layers of a building sequences and frames the pitch. But in a further thought, we could say that it is the architecture of the elevator, the architecture of modernism, that has produced a certain kind of speech. And I would argue that our present networked environment also shapes the kind of PhD we want to produce. Looking at the small print of this diagram, of this cablegram, I want to point to another exercise we looked at, footnotes. Footnotes that reveal also a less noticed but yet so fascinating world of writing. One could say, perhaps, that the footnotes on the bottom of the page describe a particular edifice of academic writing, similar to the elevator pitch, in which the orator measures the time of the talk with the floor count in a vertical movement through a building. The footnote points to a location along the vertical axis. Anthony Crafton, who dedicated a beautiful book to the curious history of the footnote, that describes it as lying beneath ground level, as waste products, toilets and sewers, where historians like archaeologists seek to turn shit into gold. If we consider a kind of down-up reading that begins with the footnotes, an architectural space is opened, revealing how a text is composed, what it is made of. One of my closest friends, still under the impression of a movie about a Sicilian family business in New York, recently commented that reading a book through its footnotes is like entering the restaurant through the kitchen to see how the food is stored and cooked and how the place is run. I'm showing you here some exercises with footnotes that we actually turned for each student into a poster. The decision to place the footnote on the bottom of the page is a gesture of courtesy to the reader, to make transparent how other research or an outside reference has saturated the author's research, to open up something of their process, of their mind space. As Roland Barthes put it, when nobody's watching, we take pleasure in a text by skimming or skipping certain passages, unconcerned with what he described as the integrity of the text. Footnotes are often entirely overlooked. But footnotes could indeed offer pleasure. They allow a glance into a library full of literature, travel accounts, newspapers, scientific reports and data, but also films and websites, links that, if followed, risk getting readers lost in that edifice or even enabling them to leave it altogether. They could, at best, be a four-dimensional library in which the words of writers reverberate across generations. Secret conversations become audible. Anecdotes and academic battles are alluded to. Perhaps even the counter-argument is given to the thesis on the main part of the page. But the cablegram reveals much more. The letterhead of the company, Cable and Wireless Limited, points us to a world of flow and connectivity. The company, developed out of a series of British telegraph companies founded in the 1860s, that helped to access and control its colonial expanse, mainly to India. Initially, most telegraph links ran overland through Europe and then to India via undersea cable. Yet as the overland section was almost prone to attacks, the British government kept investing in a new link between Britain and India. That was all undersea, apart from a relatively short length across Egypt. With the First World War, there started then a proper cable war with other companies, mainly German ones. The British companies collaborated on cutting all cable links between Germany and North America. With the increasing competition from companies using radio communications, it was decided in 1928 to merge the communications methods of the British Empire into one operating company that in 1934 received the name Cable and Wireless Limited. So since 1934, we have also this red letterhead. The firm formed subsidiary corporations in various countries, such as the Indian Radio and Cable Communications Company in 1932, designed to oversee India's external communications with other countries. However, the company made also a considerable contribution to the Allied warfare effort, supplying, for instance, the wireless equipment with which the North African campaign was conducted in 1942, in the same year of this telegram. It goes actually together, and let's say these cables that are sunk into the sea and in parts only going across the land with the conquering, let's say, of the air. We have here, it's always an image, I never knew when I could actually use it, of finding the Zeppelin in Weimar, but recently I found actually another image of the Orientfahrt of one Zeppelin ride over Jaffa in 1929, and in 1931 actually also over Jerusalem. So that was actually, I thought, fascinating that there were apparently leaflets dropped over Jaffa to announce that people should keep on their eyes up to not miss the Zeppelin. And actually, it was all a kind of a whole more of a game to send postcards from the Zeppelin and to drop it down later on bags. And I thought one of the sweet postcards here was that actually the author of this postcard sends it to a friend and asks him actually to please return it to him after he had received it. So it's actually more the kind of the gadget of sending post and flying the Zeppelin, which is obviously something we are or we used to be used to before we were locked down. Yeah, so the other large company that actually also fights off the German presence in Palestine with the Zeppelin that, as you know, the last one collapsed or was destroyed in 1937 with the Hindenburg disaster. The Imperial Airways company actually starts to conquer the air, and we have actually famously Laszlo Moholy-Nagy who designs these air routes. And when we look closer, or actually it's interesting, when he had left or was forced to leave Germany, he actually lives in the Isokon flats, in the Lawn Road flats, and probably shares one of the floors with Kim Philby, one of the double agents that will be exposed in 1963 in Beirut. So it's kind of, when we kind of reconstruct that, I find it fascinating to think of some of these protagonists being in London, and actually only today we read the history backwards. I don't have really, I mean, already with the kind of the whole story of my Hinges, there's so many moments in which to expand, and I will try to actually rather move on. Yeah, when we look closer, it's Imperial Airways has connections to Gaza. This kind of the flow of connectivity seems to be possible through new airport infrastructures that are being built, that connect obviously to new modernist projects that are being built, and that we maybe have to read always in relation to these network infrastructures, always as a kind of a moment between the static and the movement. Also, you see a long route here from London to Paris via actually Stuttgart of the Palestine Airways, not Airways, Palestine railways that make a connection to Constantinople. And as we've seen in the previous map, there's always, between the several railways, there's always a problem between Tripoli and Haifa. I mean, it's a mountainous area, but there were starting points to build actually a railway between on this route, but it was actually never realized. In fact, it was a bus service, and whoever could afford it, on a car ride that connected Haifa with Beirut. Another map shows us actually all these routes collapsing here. Actually, the British made it a secret map of actually the railways overlaying the map of oil pipelines, the Imperial Airways, the German air routes, and international boundaries. So it's kind of an interesting map, and interesting also that it was kept secret. And obviously it relates also to the enormous infrastructural system of electricity that was implemented in Palestine mainly under the Pinas Rutenberg, who builds enormous structures. I'm actually fascinated by the negatives themselves that have been affected by history, by some sort of kind of precarious storage. But again, all these moments we actually need to see between the static moments of modernist building structures. Here, a work by Benjamin Orel, who we might actually visit a few more times. And I'm actually like images like this, the kind of the infrastructural backstage, plumbing systems. In this case, it's relating to the electricity. It reminds me actually of the story of Kafka's Stoker of 1913, where, I don't know if you know it, but it was a fragment as well in itself, but the protagonist was just about to arrive in New York when he actually returns back on the ocean liner and completely deviates from his ride. And in the same way, I could here now make something about Josephine Baker also arriving as a stowaway on a boat, and we would kind of really drift off in the same way like Lawrence Stern has formulated volumes about actually a comedy about the life of Tristram Shandy, which you might have seen with his drawings on kind of funny annotations actually on how the storyline distracted from a clear narration. There are always distractions, always like windy occasions that take him off this path. So I might actually show you some of these in the following. But the map on the letterhead of the company points to also a simple and diagrammatic thesis. Modernism, the period that I cover, needs to be understood as a relation between objects and flows. Objects could be the object-like buildings of modernism, now canonized, but also institutions, sometimes architectural details and elements. The threads are the flows along which ideas, material, migrants, sometimes refugees, traveled. Modernism is the relation between these flows and objects. Effectively, we are talking about a geo-history that shifts between static and dynamic. Such maps should be the emblems of modernism, just as the clean-line functional buildings are. Nothing captures that moment of modernism more than the world map of trajectories that of course have their own colonial history, but emerge in the force of the end of World War I, referred to by many as the first act of globalization, as the first moment where global economy starts resembling a relation between multiple centers scattered throughout. I've shown you the cover of the book Dust and Data, and I actually would like to go into a chapter in which I'm actually looking at the Sykes-Picot border that has actually put an end to many of the infrastructural projects that seemed possible, such as the railway, or at least all sorts of connectivity between what was now divided as the British Mandate and the French Mandate. A kind of a division line that was drawn in 1916, but was in a way ratified during the Paris agreements in Versailles in 1919. I've actually started my essay slightly earlier than the drawing of that line, which also in a way shows how maybe absurd it was to think of dividing, let's say, the air. That was the event of a locust plague that had raided in 1915 over Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, and had actually eaten up gardens and vegetation and crops to a point that it caused within the next year hunger and starvation and diseases in the area. So one catastrophe was followed by the next, the Spanish flu, that had affected the world, and with it, strangely, almost paradoxically, also the author, the co-author of this Sykes-Picot line, Sir Mark Sykes himself, who already in the peace conference in Paris looks, here we see him in the middle seated, very fragile. Only a few days later, he passes away as a victim to the flu. So we see these flu diagrams. I mean, always when I look at them, I feel like at least it resided and it was over. It had different waves, but in a way, we can see that these waves actually show us new forms of universal connectivity. The world is drawn up as a constant flow, a borderless series of trajectories and whirlwinds. And I actually was fascinated by a work or research done by a colleague, Norbert Korek, in the school, who actually looked at the wounded of the war in Lazarette that was housed actually in the building of the Bauhaus in 1919, when Gropius was actually opening for his artists and teachers and students. There were actually still soldiers in recovering and being treated upstairs. And one could actually think that many of those soldiers, not maybe in, I couldn't find the exact link, but to imagine at least that many of the protagonists working at the Bauhaus, designers and architects, and obviously the whole cultural life was in a way also directed towards the experience of the war, and brought with it all sorts of devices and experiences. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy actually here draws a field map, in a way interesting that he keeps in 1935. He will draw the map again for the Imperial Airways. He also was, this is actually from a research from Joyce Tsai in the book, and I'm very happy we can also publish this now in German. There's a book coming out. And actually, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was a teacher already in the army. So he was actually training students in a way one could make the analogy how he trained and taught his students later at the Bauhaus. And we know him also as being fascinated by textures and microscopic research into the very materiality of new materials and let's say also microbiology. So when we look at these micro histories, I've also made the kind of, let's say, a rather blunt proposal that one can read actually from the 1918 Spanish flu virus to the 2008 SARS virus to actually the latest virus, a kind of a whole architectural history that would relate. I have to be a bit short here. Some bits I have already presented in the book, but let's say one incidence here is actually the excavation of Mark Sykes, actually with the outbreak of the SARS flu, a professor, actually Professor Oxford, undertook an excavation of the remains of Mark Sykes, who was one as such an important diplomat. He was brought from Paris to to Britain back in a lead coffin, and therefore his remained, and this professor was hoping to find actually the original Spanish flu virus. So it's in that very kind of virus archaeology that we also can look back at various kind of moments of transformations across this Sykes-Picot border. So I have then looked at several instances along this border, of which I cannot show all now, but one is maybe to look, because it relates also to the borders and transformation across what became now national borders. Actually, a site in the north, in the Golan Heights, today occupied by Israel, just when you cross the Jordan River, where it's still very narrow, you have actually two customs houses. You see on the left side the British customs house, on the right side, slightly higher on the mountains, actually the French customs house. And we could imagine that through that space, the Sykes-Picot line would have to be drawn. So what it is, the customs house relates obviously to the trading of goods, and the architecture is there to control this and manifest these border points, actually in a landscape that I have experienced as dramatically beautiful and stunning. And it's a shame that it's actually filled with but first of all, the trauma of war, conflict, and dispossession, and landmines. Some of the places are so difficult and dangerous to access that actually drone photography is highly recommended, and one can obviously reconstruct some of the historical lines and see new routes that are drawn into that area. So what I had shown you before was a ruin of the British customs house that kind of remained as a more in an Oriental style. The British didn't do much to actually a medieval Khan building. On the top of the mountain was actually, when I first visited this place, an investor who had planned to turn this ruin actually into a Bauhaus hotel. A Bauhaus boutique hotel, and I found that always incredibly strange and bizarre. Actually, I should give the credit here to Otrun Barkolz, who took this photograph with me at the time. She's presenting tomorrow. We were actually going to this place several times and saw this place transforming to see also how, let's say, a myth was in the making. To describe this building as a Bauhaus building had clearly the intention to move away from the narrative of the Sykes-Picot line and rather trying to connect to actually a Tel Aviv white modernism narrative, which is equally let's say, limited in a kind of looking at Bauhaus origins as such. Strangely, though, in the last coup, actually, with the opening of the Bauhaus celebration years in 2019, the owner used the Bauhaus logo from Dessau also as a logo for his hotel. But also the location of the hotel. Now we are really in the occupied areas of the Golan Heights, and you can see already the hotel at the same time is also a manifestation of some sort of a military outpost, a meeting point that is being celebrated here. These are the most stunning images, I have to admit, but it's quite fascinating to see that kind of transformation. On the right side, we have actually the Max Liebling house built by Dov Kami in Tel Aviv that I would relate rather to the British Mandate era. these kind of two stories of both buildings we have analyzed in a project in the last few years, actually, with the Center for Documentary Architecture, returning to this place and observing together with the curators of the Max Liebling House the kind of the transformation of this place, to study its materiality, its layers of paint, its building composites. And we came together to this very strange story that is known to political historians and economists, but for architecture it was rather surprising. We were kind of looking at building elements and try to trace them back into archival research and try to kind of corroborate them with plans, drawings, and documents. So in a way, each building element was promising a story to tell that would actually reveal some of these very complex trading processes. Our work, we actually looked at a lot at the work of Heinz Emigholz, the German filmmaker, who we know for his famous long static observations. Sometimes he lets the camera a little bit do what she wants, which we see here. But it's this kind of study of, let's say, the heroes of modernism, Auguste Perret, Adolf Loos, or Louis Barragan, here Perret rather considered as the threshold modernist, mixing classicist plans and reinforced concrete brut. And with Adolf Loos, the kind of the idea of the round plan, and here with Louis Barragan, another kind of study that actually shows us that that relation between a static camera and the moments within a trajectory, a rough. And for all these projects, we cannot just see them naively, I guess, as architectures, but we need to see them as part and moments of a rough and fast whirlwind of trajectories, of movements that modernism brings together. These are objects that simply coalesce at a meeting point of different trajectories. Think of the extremely low pressure bringing in winds from different directions, building up into a hurricane in one place, bringing building materials from one place, an idea from another, and people, migrants and refugees from yet another. Those meeting points of material ideas, trajectories of movement and migration coalesce into those objects. And in that sense, these buildings are, that we will see, are dynamic objects in the middle of historical storms. Yet again, hinges and trajectories are the way to read them. The year 1942 would send a shiver down the spine of any European refugee now in Palestine. Still, chocolate is imported. And we could actually, what I found fascinating, obviously the kind of the shipping of 50 tons of cacao from Africa to Palestine. And let's say we could now enter a whole politics of confectionaries and chocolates and coffee beans and cacao beans that are being traded in Palestine, and to a large degree actually taken away from Arab traders who were actually trading across the Levant, who were now stopped on custom points such as on the Golan Heights point. And we have now here in Tel Aviv and Ramat Gan a new chocolate factory being built for the elite chocolate factory, with all sorts of confectionery that is being produced and wrapped in nice papers and sent from there, but also traded in shops in Haifa all the way till Beirut. And we could actually, now it's another kind of, let's say, eBay search, sometimes or kind of got carried away, which is about chocolate cards. And on the one hand, there are postcards, but in the same way as we know the cigarette cards, together with chocolates, which is also one of the medium, it seems, of modernism, to use the chocolate itself, the kind of to advertise and to create, let's say, a desire for either information or for more chocolate. So I got actually carried away with these papers that were sent by this company here, Pupier, into the whole world, and it seems with different destinations and motifs. And maybe it's a bit of a too gloomy, maybe motherly comment to point out the latest building for the artificial teeth factory that somehow also matched some of my archival finds, and all of a sudden I see this factory on the letterhead by Leo Adler, actually, who has this characteristic feature of these sunshades to his artificial tooth factory, which might be needed after too much chocolate consumption. In the same way, in the very chocolate themselves, fruits are being used, and we could kind of again from this whole desire to eat chocolate, we can read with it also a whole trading economy related to citrus fruits and oranges that are being sent out into the world as export products from Palestine, actually, while other trade is still going on. So on the one hand, the famous Jaffa oranges are being sent to Europe, and on the other hand, we have actually cement and all sorts of building elements and products being imported to a large degree to subsidized from Germany, but also obviously from Britain, and mainly Britain. The Elite factory itself delivered across, still for a long time, across the whole Levant, and apparently also was feeding, delivering chocolates to a shop in Beirut, which actually comes only out with that rather dramatic news that actually in 1946, on the 9th of May, a terrorist has entered a chocolate shop in Beirut and causes I mean, nobody's dying, but considerable damage, and obviously a shock to the shopkeeper, which is described in these documents, which are sent across actually the region, I would say, between Beirut, Britain, France. Actually, the company in Tel Aviv just can hardly get proper correspondence going, because we are in the middle of a turmoil, and it's really hard to figure out where we are, which brings me actually to try to understand where could that chocolate shop be, and how did it look like when it actually happened, and people would kind of gather, and we could kind of zoom into the street and see everybody trying to understand what had actually had happened. And strangely, another news, probably by, I mean, I would now guess it was never really shown in this letter correspondence, and I could not research that in depth, but it might have been a terrorist operation also by the Irgun, also in Beirut, but also in the 31st of October, when actually the British embassy was damaged in Rome. So you see, we kind of, from that explosion, we kind of return back to a whole world map yet again. And maybe to close here, I would like to highlight actually a project we were working on actually over several years already, also because it's sensitive to work across this border between Lebanon and Israel. And but we were fascinated by the story of Antoine Tabet, who we see here in the 1950s, who was actually a student, very shortly though, but a student with Auguste Perret, and who had built in both cities, in Beirut and in Haifa. And that fascinates somehow, because both places could not be researched, both archives could not be properly researched from, let's say, from historians on both sides. So each let's say, preservationist or historian would kind of have an described space in which that research is possible. But it is so fascinating because Tabet was actually bringing also something of this, the French modernism to Beirut, and kind of passed it on and kind of developed his own modernism or interpretation of it. So here we are in Haifa for a larger working, so housing compound for the for engineers of the petrol industry. And we see actually some features that will come back in the work of Tabet, but also relate to the office of Perret, in which we had several students. And here we go around with Jad Tabet, the son of Antoine, and we look at the Hotel Saint-Georges, which is in itself one of these other vertical points in which it is fascinating to research and to actually stay, like Amy Holtz would do with that building for a while, and actually to look deeper into the very movements that went through this hotel. Jad Tabet led us to many of the buildings by Antoine Tabet, among them the Sagesse School and a church, in which we actually see, again, very almost clear references to the work of Perret, which is interesting that in the 1930s, 40s, Tabet in Lebanon would still kind of look back at this work of his former teacher. And he apparently also had plans to for an extension of the St. George Hotel in the 1960s. But what is also interesting is that another office, let's say, group of Perret went to build in the same kind of typology almost in Morocco, here for the Hotel Sada in Agadir, that unfortunately, tragically in 1960 with this enormous earthquake where thousands of victims were counted, completely collapsed. But and another hotel project in Etretat, which is interesting also because I was trying to figure out where exactly this was and whether it's still remaining, and we have to zoom in. And I guess if I see the second part, which I really hope to see, of Arsène Lupin, I don't know who has seen it, because the last series with Omar Sy in Netflix ended exactly in Etretat. I believe that here in the top right frame, if they had just turned slightly more, I would have seen, let's say, the hotel. If I have time, I would like to show like a 4 minutes short film. Stefan, is it okay? Just to kind of conclude, to bring, let's say, our research here together. It was a film I produced together with Anna-Louise Schubert and my two protagonists, Walid Karkabi from Haifa, the head of the preservation department, and Jad Tabit, the son of Antoine Tabit.
So this is the Union thing. It's this building that's in there. So now we go to the Hotel Saint-Georges. Beirut, it has nothing to do with Beirut as it was at that time. But still it's a very vivid city. It's a city where you feel the pulse of people. Well, you see just in front of you, this is the Sagesse School built by my father. It is not in a good shape now, but you know, this is it. It was built in the 30s. It's very clear. It's very typical of the concrete construction of that period, you know, very strong expression of structure, etc., etc., and then different. Well, we'll come back maybe in the afternoon. The connection was from Beirut. He was a well-known architect here, and the Reyes, you know, the Reyes family were Libano-Palestinian. I mean, they had both nationalities. And they used to come to, a lot of Palestinians used to come to Beirut during the summer, because, or more to the you know, to the sea, and more than that to the mountains, because to the Lebanese mountains. And most probably the Reyes did the same, and as he was well known in Beirut, probably the commission came this way. He had an associate, an architect in Haifa, a Jewish architect, but he used to go to Haifa, yeah, obviously. It was very easy at that time, you know.
Okay, so we are going to Tabit.
Yes.
Okay, let's go. This is an artificial stone, yes, and I have the feeling that this artificial stone was brought from Beirut also. I'm not because I'm not familiar with any institution here that they could, you know, do it, produce it. I don't know. And once more, can you stop it, please? You can see once more the horizontal lines that are so familiar with the work of Anton Tabit in the Haifa project also. 37. It's more or less the same years that he designed the project in Haifa. Okay, look at this, the same stone, the same elements that dividing the facade into horizontal and vertical elements. Very interesting, very, very interesting. Yeah, no doubt, this is Anton Tabit.
He had an associate, an architect in Haifa, a Jewish architect, but he used to go to Haifa, yeah, obviously. It was very easy at that time, you know. Finally, it's very close, you know. It's, I don't know, 3 hours, 2 hours, 3 hours, you know, by car.
Kamera läuft? Bei dir? Läuft? Gut, los geht's.
Thank you. I think I would end here. Maybe I haven't, yeah, I've just fade out. Maybe, Stefan, you tell me if it was a goodbye or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ines. I think it was just a wonderful and perfect lecture also for and especially for a doctoral colloquium. I think we also the fact that we had 1 or 2 problems with the internet connection. I mean, we didn't know where, if in Stuttgart or London or in Berlin or along the former Sykes-Picot line. We will never find out, and I will never be able even to buy a cablegram on eBay in order to find out. I think the nice thing also about this coincidence of a distraction is really perfect to talk about, actually, distractions. Distractions also during a PhD process, maybe. And if I understood you correctly, I think you, I mean, of course, we are all interested in rigor and discipline and everything. But when I listened now to your presentation, to your lecture, I could sense also a deep interest in playfulness, in playing with links and accidents, etc. And do you miss this sometimes in the world of science? And would you like to strengthen an idea of playfulness in order to tell better stories?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would maybe go back to that relation to the media, right? To be very like, and that could be many things, right? We could say it's radio, it's photography, right? Film, but or it's the kind of the latest technologies of drone photography, Röntgen, MRT scans of buildings to get closer to them. And it could be architecture itself, right? To kind of just to engage with it, to inhabit it, to stay with it. And the way we actually work at the center, but also in with the PhD students is that special relationship to this media, right? And kind of even the complication of sometimes setting up your camera to find the quiet spot. It collapses, you spend time, but it's also useful time to meet people, right? To engage with the site, to return several times, rather than just taking it for granted that it existed on this day with this beautiful background and kind of blue sky. There's sort of also something to become familiar with a place and to revisit, let's say, inhabitants or people who have something to say about the place. So in some ways, it's also about provoking knowledge production. And it's not always, and the same thing can happen in an archive, right? So when you ask for more rather than just accepting the files you're getting, to ask about the provenance, the kind of usually the exciting life, why you are actually allowed to see this document. Now, I could have shown several folders in which I have all of a sudden on actually these are documents from the Templar Bank that arrived in Berlin in the Bundesarchiv, and they are full of Soviet stamps on top, right? So it's like the whole idea that the Soviets have found them in the first place and put them into the archive. All these are layers that you unpack by engaging with them in a kind of a way that I can only describe as a form of unpacking and staying with the research. In that sense, that's important to think. I mean, now it's in PhD programs, you have very often not only by thesis, but you actually speak about by practice, right? A thesis by practice. So you bring actually architecture already into it. And I think we have still, in the last few years, we're trying to find ways to make that clearer, right? That it's not just a cut and paste of an image at the end, but that actually your work as an architect or being on site is actually producing the kind of knowledge that makes you an expert in a certain field or to a certain question. And I think there we have a lot to learn still. And for me, it's obviously I don't draw a line here between, let's say, the straightforward scholarly historian work. It's always an engagement full-heartedly in trying to perform research in some ways.
Sure. Let's stick for another minute with this topic of distraction. I was really fascinated also about these diagrams that you showed by Lawrence Stern from the Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, where the distractions of a storyline are literally drawn, etc. And I mean, this is a big question. I mean, for probably every PhD student, which excursion do you take? Which do you keep out? Do you also talking maybe about your own experiences with books and maybe your own PhD? Can you recommend something PhD students in general? I mean, when is it important to follow just pathways, and when do you need this kind of call of this order, this call back to order?
I mean, first of all, let's say there are new PhD candidates, and sometimes you have a feeling, you feel it already, that there's a lot to be researched, right? When there's a good topic or kind of a material presented to you already, it feels like you want to ask so many questions. And I think that is, for me, something I would hold as long as possible in a research work. And of course, there comes the deadline, and let's say small instances in which you have to put that into words, into chapters, into structuring. But I find it much more. I mean, this is maybe also where maybe a relationship between advisors and let's say supervisors or advisors to your work play a role, where you have like an outside look at what is particularly like to read this material differently, right? So you're looking actually for ideas in how to frame and articulate that into an idea. Into a coherent narrative, but it feels always the wrong way around to first have the narrative and then to try to support it through documents. So it's more, let's say, halfway you want to go and discover and be curious. And each, I mean, I guess the PhD is something that should also make you like as an artist or an expert, like a legal expert. So it needs that originality as well, no? And you don't get it by being framed already by a whole set of books and readings and just to navigate and present how well you're reading these, no? So it's also kind of producing new representations and actually works and performances.
There's a beautiful essay by Josef Vogel who wrote about Godard films, and I mean there are many passages in Godard films where not the narration wins, but the association, for example, through color, the color yellow, etc. And there's this essay by Josef Vogel just on the role of the color yellow in certain in one specific Godard film. Do you think that also a PhD project can be partially based on association rather than rationality, let's say? I mean, I'm thinking about also probably one of the most important architecture books of the 20th century, which is not a PhD, but it's Still Years New York, very often based on associations and not argumentations. But do you see a value in that, also in a scientific context?
I do see it, because it's kind of you want a degree of poetry or creativity in researching, and even if you organize your books by color, right? That is a way of reading the world, right? If that is, I like that kind of let's say the surrealist or experimentalist way of engaging with the work. And I think this is usually, we see great books because they came out of this kind of exercise initially. On the other hand, you see it in my work, right? I really feel bad if the image doesn't align with the story, or like if I don't have the right date at the end. I want to really pin it down because it's so relevant, if it was now 34 or 35. So when I look at my own presentation, it's for me very, very relevant. So I want to know everything about this object I'm discussing. So, and in that sense, I'm also quite mechanic or tough with myself, and want to be actually a historian in that sense, not trying to find it. And it's kind of an object that is one among many, but to give it its value, that is also a construction of sorts. No, it's you give it in architecture. So yeah, so I think you need both, but I think I'm maybe more in that sense conservative or a traditional writer type of person.
Yeah, I think you're also a trained architect, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think the discipline or pseudo discipline of architecture is especially good in establishing relations, in contrast, for example, to other art forms or other disciplines?
Well, if it doesn't do that, or if we don't read it like this, then we have misunderstood something. So it's, I mean, it's actually something I very much appreciate, especially at the work of the RCA at the moment. I mean, the kind of the engagement actually with, with latest politics, kind of feminist reading, Black Lives Matter studies and projects. I kind of feel we need to do that at an architecture school. I mean, that needs to be our environment in which we situate architecture, resituate it. And I think we need to, although I very much appreciate and love, as I said, the kind of the materiality and its clear, let's say, figuredness of architecture, but it needs to make itself relevant and take a position in our time, which relates to the discourses we invite into the teaching and debating about architecture.
Yeah, I agree. And I think maybe we can really leave it at this point, and I'm sure we will have many chances to continue our conversation also tomorrow during the second day of our PhD colloquium. Thanks again, Ines, for your presentation. And I'm really looking forward to continue our dialogue tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Stefan. It's great.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Maybe at I would like to thank also our partners, the magazine Arch Plus, first of all, but also Philipp Krüppel, my colleague at the IGmA, who's the producer of this series, and Leo Hermann, my colleague also at the IGmA, who is responsible for the stage set. And I would like to thank also, last but not least, the supporters of the SToA series, which are the Stuttgarter Wohnungs- und Städtebaugesellschaft, the Stiftung Landesbank Baden-Württemberg, and the Bietigheimer Wohnbau GmbH. Thank you very much for everything and have a good night. Bye.